Part 1. Renford Hall knew how to keep a silence, and Beatrice, Duchess of Rothbury, had learned to read them the way her late father once read weather off the London docks. By the slant of the light, the temper of the servants, the careful faces of men who carried news they would rather not deliver. The news came on a grey Tuesday, folded inside a letter from her cousin. Beatrice read it once at the breakfast table, while her daughter Lucy arranged toast soldiers into a small fortress, and read it a second time in her sitting room, where no one could measure her by her face. Her husband had taken a mistress. Not discreetly, as men of his rank were expected to manage such things, but in full view, squiring Miss Coralie Fenn, a singer of 19, through the theatres and supper rooms of the season while all of society watched and murmured behind their gloves. The Duke of Rothbury, her cousin wrote, seemed almost proud of the display. The Duchess, everyone assumed, would do what duchesses did. She would bear it. Beatrice set the letter on the desk and pressed it flat, as though it might rise and speak. 3 years of marriage had taught her the shape of her husband's coldness. Theirs had been a bargain struck between a proud title and a dead man's money. Her father's ships and warehouses had lifted the debt from Rothbury lands, and in exchange Josiah Vane's daughter had been made a duchess. Alexander Hartley had married the fortune with impeccable manners, and had never once pretended the fortune arrived attached to a woman he meant to know. She had made her peace with a distant husband. She had never agreed to be made a public jest. Down the corridor, Lucy laughed at something the nursemaid said, and the sound settled the last of Beatrice's uncertainty like a hand pressed to an open wound. Whatever her husband thought he was spending in London, he was spending her name too, and their daughters. And she would not let the child inherit a mother the world pitied. She rang for paper and pen. The letters she wrote that afternoon were not to her husband. The first went to Mr. Aldous, her father's solicitor, a dry man who had loved Josiah Vane and distrusted every peer in England. The second went to the steward at Rothbury's largest tenant farm, asking, with great courtesy, exactly how the accounts stood, for she had signed nothing, seen nothing, and been told, always, that such matters need not trouble her. That, she thought, had been her mistake. She had let them tell her what need not trouble her. Mr. Aldous arrived within the week, dusty from the road and sharp as a new blade. He laid a leather folio on the table between them and opened it with the reverence of a man opening a Bible. "Your father," he said, "did not trust dukes. He was fond of you, madame, and fonder still of protecting his money from men who spend other people's. When your marriage was drawn, he insisted on certain clauses. I doubt his grace read them closely. Men in a hurry to be rich rarely do." Beatrice drew the folio toward her. She read slowly, her finger tracing each line, and as she read, something cold and clear began to gather in her chest. Not grief, which she had already spent, but purpose. Her dowry had not been given. It had been placed in trust, with herself as its living heart. The mortgage on the Rothbury estates had not been discharged by her father's fortune. It had been bought by it. Her father, that shrewd old shipping man, had made himself the estate's creditor rather than its rescuer. And now that debt, and the paper that governed it, belonged to her. She looked up. Aldous was watching her with something close to hope. "He believes he wants this house," she said quietly. "He believes he owns me and everything I brought him. He believes wrongly." Beatrice closed the folio and set both hands upon it. "Then let him finish his season," she said. "Let him spend it all. And let the Duke of Rothbury come home to a house that no longer bends to him." Part 2. Beatrice began with the people, because her father had taught her that money followed loyalty and never the reverse. She walked the estate herself through the cold end of spring. The tenant farms, the mill, the cottages with their sunken roofs that the Duke's agent had promised, for 2 years, to mend. She listened. She remembered names. When old Mrs. Corbett wept over a leaking hearth, Beatrice did not offer comfort. She offered a roofer, paid from her own hand within the fortnight. Word of that roofer traveled faster than any sermon. Inside Renford Hall she found the same neglect wearing finer clothes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, had run the place on shrinking funds and swallowed insults for years, expecting a duchess who would add to her burdens. Instead, Beatrice sat with her over the account books until midnight, asked her opinion and took it. By June the household no longer looked to London for its orders. It looked to the woman who had stayed. The books themselves told the true story. Rothbury was not merely embarrassed. It was hollow. The Duke had borrowed against next year and the year after that, and the only pillar still holding the roof aloft was the very trust her father had built. Every quarter the estate paid interest. To her, Mr. Aldous helped her quietly consolidate what was hers. She did not seize. She did not threaten. She simply made herself the ground on which her husband stood, and let him remain ignorant of it a while longer. Only then did she go to London. She took a house of her own. Not Rothbury House, with its shrouded furniture and its memories. But a bright set of rooms in a good street paid from her trust. She ordered new gowns, severe and elegant, in colors the dowager would have called too plain and every other woman envied within a week. And she began, with patience, to be seen. Society is a suspicious animal, but it adores a mystery, and a wronged duchess who neither wept nor hid was the finest mystery of the season. Beatrice did not speak of her husband. She spoke of books, of shipping, of the price of grain, of anything a clever woman might know and a foolish one would not. Hostesses who had ignored the merchant's daughter now competed to seat her. The dowager duchess found her at Lady Ashford's rout. "You are making a spectacle," the old woman said, her voice low and precise. "A wife who parades her wounds is worse than a husband who wanders." "I am not aware of parading anything," Beatrice answered. "I am aware of dancing and of dining and of being asked my opinion, which is more than my husband ever thought to do. You will forgive him and you will go home. That is what wives of this family do. I did it. My mother did it before me." Beatrice studied the lined, proud face and understood, with a pang she had not expected, that she was looking at a warning and a wound wearing the same expression. "I am sorry that you did," she said gently, and left the old woman speechless in the crowd. It was that same night that she met the Marquess of Linden. He did not flatter her. That was the first thing she noticed. He asked whether the reports of poor harvests in the north were as grim as the papers claimed, and listened to her answer as though it might change his vote in the Lords. He was near 40, unmarried, with a widower's quiet and a habit of saying exactly what he meant. "You are the talk of London, Your Grace," he said. "It seems to trouble you very little." "It troubles me not at all," Beatrice said. "A woman who fears talk gives it power." Linden inclined his head, and something in the look he gave her was steadier and warmer than admiration. Across the room, the crowd parted, and she saw her husband. The Duke of Rothbury stood by the terrace doors with Miss Coralie Fenn on his arm, the girl bright and laughing, the Duke's face arranged into its usual careless mastery. He had not expected his wife here. She watched him see her, watched the careless mask falter, watched him take in the plain grey gown, the ring of listeners, the Marquess at her side. Beatrice met his eyes cross the whole length of the room, and she did not look away. He was the one who did. Part 3. Miss Coralie Fenn was not a cruel girl, but she was a frightened one, and frightened people reach for the nearest weapon. Hers that evening was a duchess in a plain grey gown. It happened at the supper. Beatrice was seated among the great hostesses, drawn there by her own strange new gravity, when the singer's clear voice carried across 2 tables, pitched to be heard. "I confess I pity her," Coralie said, "to no one and to everyone. A woman kept in the country like a good piece of furniture. One cannot blame a man for wanting music in his house instead of an account book." A ripple of laughter began. It was the laughter of people uncertain which way to fall, and in that instant the whole table's loyalty hung in the balance. Beatrice set down her glass. She did not flush, she did not falter. She turned toward the girl with an expression of mild, genuine interest, as one might regard a child reciting a lesson. "You are quite right," she said, and her voice was warm, unhurried and entirely clear. "An account book is dull company. But it does have one virtue over music, Miss Fenn. When the season ends and the singing stops, the account book is still there, and it still knows precisely who owns the house." The pause that followed was not silence, exactly. It was the sound of 40 people deciding, at once, whom they preferred to be seen agreeing with. Then Lady Ashford laughed, a rich, delighted, unmistakable laugh. And the tide turned as surely as a river finding a lower field. By morning the story had crossed London. The Duchess of Rothbury had not wept, had not fled, had answered the slur with a jest so sharp it drew blood without a raised voice. Overnight, pity became fascination, and fascination, in the ton, is worth more than beauty. The Duke heard the tale at his club. He heard it, in fact, before he had ordered his coffee. 2 younger men laughing over the account book that knew who owned the house. Unaware the Duke stood behind their chairs. He heard Linden's name spoken beside his wife's with an approval that had never once attached to his own. He heard himself described, by a man he had known since Eton, as the greatest fool of the season, flaunting an opera girl while his wife walks off with the whole of society and the Marquess besides. Alexander Hartley had been many things in his life, but rarely, until that morning, a man laughed at. He wrote to her that afternoon. He was not a man given to apology, and the letter showed it. 3 careful pages that explained, and reasoned, and reminded her of her duty, and never once said the word, sorry. He sealed it with the Rothbury crest and sent it to her house in the good street. It came back the next day, the seal unbroken. He stood in his study a long while, turning the returned letter in his hands, and understood that she had not so much as read it. That she had held it, recognized his hand, and declined him without a word. The refusal landed harder than any argument could have. A quarrel would have meant she still wished to be heard. This meant she had stopped waiting to be answered. He found her 3 nights later at the opera, a cruelty of chance, since it was Coralie's own house, and cornered her in the corridor between the boxes, where the gaslight was thin and the crowd thinned with it. "You embarrass me," he said, low. "I have embarrassed no one," Beatrice replied. "You did that yourself, quite thoroughly, and I have merely declined to share the shame. You are my wife, I am aware of it. I have been aware of it for 3 years, in a house where you never were." She drew her wrap closer, unhurried, and looked at him with a steadiness that unnerved him more than tears would have. "You spent a season proving you did not need me, Rothbury. I have spent it discovering the same. The difference is that I meant it." She stepped past him toward the light and the sound of the crowd. She had not raised her voice. She had not wept, or pleaded, or given him a single crack to widen. She had simply stopped needing him. And he stood in the dim corridor, a duke in his own city, watching the one door he had never bothered to knock upon close quietly in his face. Part 4. The Duke came home to Renford Hall in July, expecting the comfort of a place that answered to him. He found, instead, a house that had learned to run without asking his leave. The roofs were mended. The hall was warm. Servants he half recognized moved with a briskness they had never shown him. And when he called for the steward came with the account books already under his arm, and gave them, first, a glance toward the Duchess's closed study door, as though seeking a permission the Duke had not granted. Alexander noticed that glance. He noticed everything. Now that the ground had begun to feel uncertain beneath him, he sent for the books. He read them at his father's great desk, in his father's chair, and the longer he read, the colder the room seemed to grow. Though it was high summer and the windows stood open to the roses, Rothbury was solvent. That was the first shock. After years of quiet decay, the estate breathed steadily again, mended and paid and running true. The second shock followed the first, line by patient line, until it could no longer be mistaken. The estate's chief creditor, the holder of its old mortgage, the trust that took its quarterly interest, the hand that had bought every debt he had scattered across London, was his wife. Not her father. Not some distant bank. Beatrice. She held the paper on the house he sat in, the fields he trod, the very chair beneath him. He was still holding the ledger when the dowager found him. His mother sat without being asked, folded her hands, and looked at him with an expression he had not seen since his boyhood. The one she wore when a truth could no longer be postponed. "Your father did the same to me," she said. "The same girl, near enough. A different name, a different year." I wept, and then I stopped weeping, and I taught myself that this was what dukes were and what duchesses endured. And then I taught it to you. Her voice did not shake, but her hands pressed harder together. "I told your wife to forgive you and go home. I told her to be what I was. She refused me, Alexander. And sitting here now, an old woman with nothing to show for 40 years of enduring, I find I am glad she did." He said nothing. There was nothing in him prepared to answer it. The study door opened, and Beatrice came in. She had known, of course, that he would find the ledgers. She had chosen not to hide them. A woman who hides her strength invites a man to test it. She crossed to the desk and stood on the far side of it, and for the space of a breath neither of them spoke. "You have questions," she said. "I will save you the trouble of asking them cleverly. Yes, the debt is mine. Yes, I could call it in tomorrow and see you ruined by autumn. And no, I have not decided whether I shall. You would beggar your own daughter's inheritance. I would protect it," she said, "from the man who was spending it on an opera box. Lucy will have a house that stands, Rothbury, whether or not she has a father worth the name." He rose then, slowly, and rounded the desk, not toward her, but toward the window, where the roses she had ordered pruned back to health now climbed thick and heavy against the glass. "What is it you want?" he said. "Money you have. Society you have. Say the price and let us be done." "That," Beatrice said, "is exactly the trouble. You believe there must be a price, because you have never wanted anything you could not purchase." She drew a breath. "Here are my terms, and they are the only ones. You will end the arrangement with Miss Fenn. Not quietly, not with a settlement to keep her sweet, but wholly. You will live here or you will live apart, but you will not live falsely. And you will earn the right to sit at my table, because you have never once done so." She turned toward the door. "And if I refuse?" he said. Beatrice paused with her hand upon the latch, and did not turn around. "Then I shall take our daughter to my father's house in the spring," she said, "and Rothbury may keep its roses and its debts and its lonely great chair. I have learned to live without you, Alexander. The question left is whether you can bear to let me." She opened the door and went out, and left him alone with the answer. Part 5. The Duke ended it in August, and he did it badly, because he had never learned how to do such things well. He went to Coralie's rooms meaning to be cold and found he could not be. The girl had guessed already. The returned letter and the whispers had reached even her. And she met him standing, her chin high and her fear plain beneath it. He had thought her a diversion. He saw now she was 19 and clever, and had gambled her whole future on a duke's attention because the world offered a girl of her sort so few other bets. "You are sending me away," she said.
I am.
He set a bank draft on the table, generous, careful, and she looked at it and then at him with something that was almost pity. "She frightens you," Coralie said. "Your wife. You spent all spring proving you did not care, and now you cannot stop caring." I sang for a man who wanted not to feel anything at all. She took the draft, because she was not a fool, and folded it away. "Go home, your grace. Learn her name. It's a poor thing to have a wife 3 years and never trouble to." He went home, and there, awkwardly and often clumsily, he began. He did not send jewels. He had learned that much. Instead he rose early and rode the estate as she did, and found the tenants regarded it strange him as a stranger on his own land, and made himself stay and listen until they did not. He asked Mrs. Finch how the house was run and did not interrupt when she told him. He learned, from the nursemaid, that his daughter's name day fell in September. And that Lucy was frightened of thunder and fond of a wooden horse, with one ear chewed off. And he sat with the child through a storm one night, holding the one-eared horse and telling her a foolish story about a knight. And Lucy fell asleep against his arm as though he had always been a father she could lean on. Beatrice watched all of it and let none of it move her too quickly. She had seen men be charming before. She had married one. Charm was cheap. It was constancy that cost, and constancy could only be proven by time. But time was the one thing she had less of than she pretended. For the Marquess of Linden had come to Rothbury. He came openly, correctly, with a letter of introduction to the Dowager and every propriety observed. And when he found a moment alone with Beatrice in the walled garden, he laid his offer down as plainly as he had laid down every honest thing he had said to her. "I am not a romantic man, your grace," Linden said. "I will not pretend to feelings I have not earned the right to name. But I know your situation, and I know the law better than most, and I have come to tell you this. A separation can be arranged. Quietly, cleanly, with your fortune protected and your daughter safe. I would stand your friend through all of it, and if, in time, you should wish for more than friendship. I am a patient man, and I have waited before." He did not touch her. He did not press. He offered, and then he waited. And the waiting itself was a kind of respect she had gone 3 years without. Beatrice looked at the roses. Heavy on the wall her husband now pruned with his own hands, and at the honest, steady man who was offering her the one thing she had told herself she wanted most. A clean way out, and a life where she would never again be second to a singer or a debt or a title's cold pride. It would be so easy to say yes. That was the danger of it. Not that Linden tempted her heart, but that he tempted her exhaustion, her long-held ache to simply be chosen first by someone for once. "You are the better man," she said at last, and meant it. "I do not think you know how nearly I could love you for asking." Linden inclined his head, reading the word she had not yet said. "But you have not answered me," he said gently. And Beatrice, who had walked away from her husband without a backward glance, found that she could not, for the length of a long and terrible breath, give the Marquess his answer either. Part 6. The scandal broke before Beatrice could speak the word she had not spoken. Coralie Fenn had taken the Duke's bank draft, but the world had not finished with the girl, and a discarded mistress with a folio of a Duke's letters is a temptation the scandal sheets will always pay for. Whether from spite or need, and Beatrice, who understood the narrow choices left to such a girl, suspected need. The letters found their way into print. 3 mornings running, London breakfasted on the private correspondence of the Duke of Rothbury. His careless words, his colder ones, and worst of all, a line written that first spring in which he had called his marriage, a transaction I regret only at the bank's convenience. There it sat, in cheap ink, for all the town to read. The Duchess he had wronged, the wife he had named a transaction, the pity that had once been Beatrice's, and had turned to fascination, now curdled towards something worse, the delicious, devouring interest of a society that sends a marriage bleeding out. When the Rothburys appeared at Lady Ashford's autumn ball, the whole room turned to watch them the way a crowd turns to watch a carriage overturn. Beatrice had come because retreat would have been a kind of confession. She stood straight-backed in dark green, her face composed, and felt the ice crawl over her, and prepared to endure a public flaying with the dignity that was by now her only armor. She did not expect her husband to speak. Alexander Hartley crossed the floor to her side, not to shelter behind her, as he had all spring, but to stand plainly beside her where every eye could measure him. And then, in a voice pitched not to whisper but to carry, he did the one thing no one in that room had ever seen a Duke of Rothbury do. He humbled himself. "You have all read a foolish, cruel thing I wrote," he said, and the crowd stilled around him. "I will not insult my wife by pretending I did not write it. I did. I was a man who valued a fortune and could not be troubled to value the woman who came with it, and I said so, in ink, like a coward." He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Beatrice. "I have spent this summer learning what I threw away in that spring, and I find I am not fit to stand in the same house as her, let alone at the same table. Laugh at me if you like. You could not think worse of me tonight than I think of myself." The room did not laugh. A ballroom will forgive almost anything but weakness, and there is a strength in a proud man kneeling that unsettles even the cruel. Lady Ashford, who had turned the tide once before with a laugh, turned it now with silence, and behind her fan she watched the Duchess with open, avid hope. Beatrice stood very still. She believed him. That was what struck her, standing there with the whole of society waiting on her face. She looked at her husband and found, at last, a man telling the truth at cost to himself, with nothing to gain by it and everything to lose. The change was real. She could no longer pretend otherwise, and it would have been so easy, in that softened, breathless moment, to let the room have its happy ending. To take his arm. To be, once more, a wife. But Beatrice had learned the price of being easy to keep. "I hear you," she said quietly. "For him, not for the room. I believe you. That is a great deal more than I believed a month ago." She drew on her gloves, slowly, with perfect composure. "But I have been made a public thing twice this year, Rothbury. Once by your carelessness and once tonight by your penitence. I will not be the neat ending to your evening's performance." And she turned, and walked from the ballroom with her head high, through a crowd that parted for her like water, and left him standing alone in the light of every chandelier. A duke who had, at last, learnt exactly how it felt to watch the door close and not know whether it would ever open again. Part 7. He did not chase her from the ballroom. That, she would learn, was the beginning of his understanding. That a man who has spent his pride chasing his own comfort must, for once, sit still in his discomfort and let a woman choose in her own time. He came to Renford Hall a week later, not as its master but as a caller, and asked, through Mrs. Finch, whether the Duchess would receive him. She let him wait an hour. He waited without complaint. When at last she came to the study, he was standing, not at his father's great desk but before it, on the near side, where petitioners stand. And on the desk lay the leather folio she knew as well as her own hand. The trust, the mortgage, the paper that held his house and his fields and his name in her keeping. Beside it lay a second document, freshly drawn in Mr. Aldos's dry, careful script. "I asked Aldous to prepare it," Alexander said. "It signs the whole of it back to you and to Lucy, free and clear, held in trust beyond my reach forever. Whatever you decide, Rothbury can never again spend a shilling that is truly yours. I have already signed." She looked at the papers and understood what he had done. He had given away his only hold on her. A man who wished to bargain kept his leverage. A man who wished to be chosen surrendered it. He had made himself, willingly, a duke who owned nothing his wife did not permit him. And he had done it before she gave him any answer at all. "You have made yourself poor," she said. "I have made myself honest," he answered. "It is a poorer estate than I am used to, and a truer one." He drew a breath, and for once there was nothing careless in his face, nothing arranged. "I am not asking you to forgive the spring, Beatrice. I am asking nothing. Lyndon can give you a cleaner life than I ever will, and if you choose it, I will sign whatever frees you and I will not say a word against it. I only wanted you to choose, knowing that I want you. Not the fortune, not the roof, not the neat ending. You, which is the one thing I never troubled to say when saying it would have cost me nothing." The room was quiet. Through the window, the roses he had tended all summer bent in the September wind. Beatrice had walked away from him once in a ballroom, and once in a corridor, and each time her power had lain in her leaving. She understood, standing here, that the harder thing, the braver thing, was to stay when staying was at last a free woman's choice and not a wife's sentence. She crossed to the desk. She picked up the pen. And she wrote, beneath his name on the deed that begat him, a single line returning the estate to them both, jointly held, neither able to spend it without the other's hand. "There," she said. "Not yours, and not mine. Ours. It is how a marriage ought to have been drawn the first time." She set down the pen and looked up at him. "You will earn it still, Alexander. Every day, and not once at a ball for the pleasure of a crowd. But you may earn it here, at my table, as you wished." He did not reach for her at once. He had learned, finally, to wait. When Lucy ran in from the garden with a rose too thorny to hold, and both her parents bent to help her, at the same moment, their hands met over the child's, and neither pulled away. The Marquess of Linden received a letter that same week, and read it, and folded it with the grace of a man who had never gambled on a certainty. He wished them well, and meant it, and married 2 years later a woman who deserved his patience, The ton found other marriages to bury. The dowager, watching her son learn to be a husband at 40, said little, but she began to smile again. Aunt Beatrice, Duchess of Rothbury, who had endured a season of humiliation and answered it not with tears but with quiet patient power, came at last to the one thing her fortune could never have bought her, a husband who had chosen her freely, having nothing left to gain, and a house that at last belonged to them both.